Imagine a place where the air was thick with the odors of smoke, sour ale, and lingering fear. A place where a traveler could find dubious lodging and even more dubious company, paying for it with his last savings or even risking his life. This is not the setting for another fantasy movie, but the ordinary, brutal reality of a medieval English inn. Today, we will peel away the veil of illusion and dive into the true, often frightening atmosphere of these harsh establishments. We will find out what taverns were really like for people of that era, an era of constant struggle for survival, brutal wars, hunger, and bitter cold. Our goal is to show you the medieval inn as it really was, not a place for fun, but a harsh necessity that reflected the hardships and dangers of the time. Prepare to be immersed in a world where survival depended on luck, ingenuity, and the ability to adapt to harsh conditions. This is a story of hunger, cold, and the daily struggle for life. In today's world, with its high-speed highways and comfortable hotels, it is hard to imagine how risky and exhausting any journey in medieval England was. The roads, if you could call them that, were often broken ruts that turned into impassable mud that sucked up wagons and travelers' feet after any rain. A journey of even a few dozen miles could take days or even weeks. Every step exposed the traveler to the risk of attack by ruthless brigands who lurked in the forests and deserted stretches of the journey. The vagaries of the weather, from scorching heat to bitter cold and prolonged downpours, were also constant companions of any traveler, adding to the suffering and danger. Disease was at every turn, for hygiene was a tentative concept, and medical care was virtually non-existent for most. In such harsh conditions, the inn became not just a place of rest, but a vital node in a complex and dangerous infrastructure. It was a beacon of hope at the end of a long and difficult day. For a merchant leading his caravan with valuable goods, the inn offered a chance not only to rest, but also to secure his possessions, at least for the night. For the soldier, rushing to the rendezvous point of his squad or returning from the battlefields, it was a chance to get a hot meal and forget himself in a mug of ale for a while. A pilgrim going to distant holy places found here a temporary shelter to gain strength to continue his spiritual journey. Even a simple peasant going to the fair in a neighboring town saw in the inn the only hope for a roof over his head and protection from the dangers of the night. Without these islands of civilization scattered along dusty and muddy roads, many territories would have remained virtually impassable and undeveloped. The authorities of the time, though not always effectively, recognized the importance of maintaining roads for trade, government, and military needs. There were even special edicts and laws obliging local feudal lords and communities to keep the roads and bridges on their lands in good repair. Inns, known as inns for the more affluent or alehouses for the less affluent, fit seamlessly into this system, providing a much-needed service. The length of a typical day's journey rarely exceeded 20, at most 30 miles. And by evening, every traveler, whether on foot or on horseback, strove with his last strength to reach a saving shelter. To remain on the road after dark was tantamount to suicide, for the night belonged to predators and brigands. So, after a long, torturous, and dangerous day's journey, our weary medieval traveler finally spots the vague signs of human habitation ahead. But what exactly does he see? One should not expect to see a neat and friendly inn, shining clean and invitingly cozy, as it is often shown in the movies. Most likely it would be a rude, squat, often 1 or 1.5 story structure, built of whatever was at hand. In wooded areas it was wood, in other areas it was wild stone, or a shanty, which was clay abundantly mixed with straw and dung for strength. The windows, if they were present at all, were narrow, disproportionately small slits, barely letting in daylight and even less fresh air. They were often devoid of glass, which was expensive in those days. Instead, the openings were covered with oiled cloth, ox blood, or simply closed with rough wooden shutters. From the chimney, if there was one, or simply from a hole in the thatched or tiled roof, blue smoke drifted lazily and reluctantly. The sign, if it graced the facade, was as plain and simple as possible, even for the vast majority of the illiterate population of the time. Often it was just a bundle of ivy, hops, or other evergreen branches, an ancient symbol of a drinking establishment dating back to Roman times. Sometimes it was a crudely drawn image of a barrel, a large mug, a boar's head, or other animal, which was supposed to symbolize the name of the inn or the main dish served. Around the building itself, there was usually indescribable filth and squalor. Slops, food scraps, and other refuse were thrown under the walls, where pigs and stray dogs were happy to dig in them. The manure from the horses that stayed in the yard was also rarely cleaned up, mixing with the road dirt. The air was filled with distinctive, not always pleasant sounds. Drunken shouts, fragments of coarse songs, or fierce swearing came from inside, heralding an uneasy atmosphere. To this was added the barking of guard or stray dogs, the neighing of tired horses in the yard, and the shrill creak of poorly oiled door hinges. The first impression of a medieval inn was rarely reassuring or serene. But rather a clear warning. Here you can shelter from the storm and the cold, but keep your ears open, watch your purse, and trust no one. Sanitary conditions in the towns and villages of that era were, to put it mildly, appalling, and taverns were no exception. On the contrary, because of the large number of people and animals, as well as the disregard for elementary standards of cleanliness, they often became real breeding grounds for contagion and unsanitary conditions. When the traveler crossed the high-worn threshold, he entered the main room of the inn, its heart and soul, if I may say so. The first thing that hit his nose and made his eyes water was the thick, acrid smoke that hung in a dense veil under the low ceiling. The central hearth, often located right in the middle of the earthen or stone floor, served both for heating the room and for cooking simple food. There may not have been a chimney in the modern sense of the word. The smoke lazily escaped through a special hole in the roof, or simply seeped through numerous gaps in the walls and ceiling. The smoke made everything around, walls, ceiling beams, the few pieces of furniture, covered with a thick layer of greasy soot. The lighting in such a room was minimal and extremely dim. The tallow candles, made of animal fat, smoked heavily, spreading an unpleasant odor, and gave very little light. Even more often, the lighting was done with lamplight, thin, long slivers of dry wood that were stuck in special slots in the walls, in stands, or simply held in the hands. They burned quickly, smoked, and needed constant replacement, creating more smoke than light and posing a constant fire hazard. In this perpetual twilight, punctuated by the occasional glimmer of fire from the hearth, it was hard to distinguish the rough-hewn, massive tables and equally primitive benches. They were often rickety and uncomfortable, covered with stains from spilled ale and fat, and carved with the names and symbols of previous visitors. The floor could be simply earthen, tamped down to the hardness of stone by the feet of hundreds of visitors, or, in the best cases, boarded. But even the board floor was rarely cleaned, and it was invariably dirty, sticky with spilled drinks and leftover food. Often the floor was covered with straw, reeds, or dry leaves. Theoretically, this was done to keep warm and to absorb dirt, spit, and spilled liquids. In practice, however, this bedding was changed very rarely, perhaps once every few weeks or even months. It became a veritable breeding ground for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other vermin, as well as a source of disgusting odor. There were traces of past feasts, fights, vomit, and other delights of inn life. Chickens and sometimes pigs were free to roam the common room, searching for edible remnants. And the smells. Oh, it was a separate, unforgettable symphony of odors, capable of knocking down an unaccustomed person. To the ubiquitous smell of smoke and soot, there was the sharp, sour spirit of sour or young ale, the heavy odor of the sweat of dozens of unwashed bodies, the scent of spoiled or burnt food, wet dog, and God knows what else. The typical layout of an inn usually included this large common room, which served as both a dining room, drinking room, and socializing area. The kitchen, if you could call it that, was often just a corner by the hearth with cauldrons and rudimentary utensils. There were also several rooms or cubbyholes for sleeping. The main and virtually the only drink available in any medieval English inn was, without a doubt, ale. However, do not imagine the sparkling, golden, and filtered drink we know today by that name. Medieval ale was quite different. It was brewed from barley or wheat malt, water, and wild yeast, without the addition of hops, which give modern beer its bitterness and flavor. Hops began to be used in England much later, coming from the continent. The ale was cloudy, thick, often sweet, and very nutritious, for which it was sometimes called liquid bread. The quality of ale varied greatly from one inn to another, and even from one cask to another in the same establishment. It depended on the skill of the brewer, often the innkeeper's wife, the quality of the ingredients, and the storage conditions. Often the ale was sour, over-aged and spoiled, or, on the contrary, too young, raw and under-fermented. In an effort to increase their profits, innkeepers often made various tricks. They diluted the ale with water, used poor quality or spoiled grain, and sometimes added dubious ingredients for flavor or strength. Drinking such ale was not only unpleasant, but also downright dangerous. One could easily get a serious stomach upset or even poisoning. However, despite all the risks, ale was much more preferable to water. Water from wells, rivers, or lakes, especially near settlements, was often contaminated with domestic sewage, human and animal waste. Consuming it raw was a direct route to dysentery, typhoid, cholera, and other dangerous intestinal infections that claim many lives. So even young children were often given so-called small beer instead of water, a very weak, almost non-alcoholic ale that underwent a fermentation process and was thus a safer alternative to dubious water. It also helped make up for the lack of calories in a meager diet. Wine was certainly available, but it cost much more than ale and was considered a drink for wealthier visitors, nobles, rich merchants, or high-ranking churchmen. It was imported mainly from France, Bordeaux, Burgundy, Spain, or the German lands along the Rhine. However, even here, the innkeepers did not miss a chance to deceive a gullible customer. Wine was often diluted with water, tinted with berry juice, or mixed with the remains of different varieties and qualities, giving the resulting junk as an expensive drink. Fraud was widespread. There were even special royal or town officials, so-called ale conners or ale tasters, who were supposed to supervise the quality and prices of ale, as well as the correctness of measures. But their supervision was far from always effective, especially in remote rural inns. So every sip in a medieval inn was a kind of lottery with an unpredictable outcome. If the drinks in a medieval inn were quite complicated and risky, the food was often even worse, especially for the poor traveler. One should not expect from a medieval innkeeper a varied menu with exquisite dishes. The food offered was simple, coarse, and aimed more at satisfying hunger than at gastronomic pleasure. The basis of the diet, as for the overwhelming majority of the population of that time, from peasant to city dweller, was bread. It was usually a heavy dark bread made from rye, barley, or oat flour, often with bran added. It was dense, hearty, but often stale and hard, requiring strong teeth. Wheat white bread, soft and airy, was considered a luxury and was the privilege of the nobility and very rich people. It was very rare to find it in an ordinary inn, unless it was for especially honorable guests who were willing to pay well for it. Hot food, if offered at all, was usually a thick broth, stew, or porridge cooked in a large common pot over the hearth. This cauldron was filled with whatever was at hand or could be bought cheaply at the market. Root vegetables, turnips, rutabagas, parsnips, carrots, onions, beans, peas, lentils, wild edible herbs and roots. Meat was very rare on the table of a traveler in an inn. If it did get into the common pot, it was most likely cheap trimmings, offal, entrails, heads, legs, bones for cooking, or meat from old, sick, or dead animals bought for nothing. Sometimes it could be the meat of game caught by the innkeeper or bought from poachers. In coastal areas or near large rivers and lakes, one could count on salted, dried, or smoked fish, herring, cod, eel. However, even here, no one was immune from buying long ago spoiled, bad-smelling goods, which the innkeeper tried to disguise with spices or prolonged cooking. Fresh fruits and vegetables were strictly seasonal and a rarity on the inn table, especially during the long and cold winter months. The main methods of preserving food for the winter were pickling, smoking, curing, and drying, which did not have the best effect on its flavor, texture, and nutritional value. Vitamins in such a diet were extremely scarce. In times of crop failures, droughts, floods, and subsequent famines, which were not uncommon in medieval Europe, inn menus became even more meager and food prices skyrocketed. The innkeepers themselves struggled to survive and could not offer their guests anything but the bare essentials, and even then at a premium. Food poisoning caused by eating stale or poor quality food was common. Many travelers seeking relief from the hardships of travel and hunger at the inn only found new health problems, from simple stomach upset to serious infections that could end in disaster. After a meager and often poor quality dinner, washed down with dubious ale, the traveler, exhausted by the long journey, dreamed of only one thing: sleep and rest. But here too, harsh trials awaited him, far from modern notions of comfort. Forget about separate, clean rooms with comfortable beds and fresh linen. In most medieval inns, especially those that catered to the poorer public, sleeping accommodation was simply a place in a common sleeping room. This room was often called the Great Chamber, or common sleeping room. Here, straw bunks were scattered on the earthen or board floor, or on roughly made wooden bunks. These mattresses, stuffed with ordinary straw, hay, or dry leaves, were rarely ventilated, cleaned, or changed. They quickly became breeding grounds for dust, dirt, and, most unpleasantly, numerous parasitic insects, fleas, lice, bedbugs, which caused the sleepers immense suffering, preventing them from sleeping and carrying diseases. The linens, if present at all, were coarse, yellowed canvas sheets and equally shabby thin blankets. They were often shared by several guests or passed from one to another without washing, retaining the odors and traces of their previous owners. Often, a traveler had to share his improvised bed, not only with a host of insects, but also with complete strangers. Men, women, children, all slept huddled closely together, trying to keep warm and get some rest in this unpleasant environment. Personal space or privacy was out of the question. There was no hygiene to speak of in such conditions. Washing, if practiced, was reduced to splashing cold, often muddy water in the face from a common basin or tub in a corner somewhere. Soap was a luxury available to the few. In winter, all these charms were joined by a penetrating, bitter cold. Poorly fitted doors and windows, gaps in the walls allowed icy drafts to pass through the sleeping quarters. As a rule, there was no heating in the sleeping rooms. The only source of heat was the bodies of neighbors and their own clothes. Not surprisingly, in such unsanitary and cold conditions, diseases ranging from the common cold, cough, and fever to more serious and dangerous infections, such as typhoid, dysentery, or even leprosy and plague during epidemics spread easily and quickly. The inn could be a trap for a weakened traveler. Medieval inns were a melting pot of people from all walks of life, professions, and morals. Under their smoky and often leaky roofs, the most diverse and unpredictable public gathered, each with their own goals, fears, and hopes. Tired travelers like our conditional hero sought here basic rest, food, and protection from the dangers of the night. They were the most numerous but also the most vulnerable category of visitors, often becoming the object of attention of less sensitive individuals. Merchants carrying valuable goods, cloth, spices, metals, and more importantly, large sums of money, stayed overnight, constantly on edge and fearing for the safety of their property and their lives. They tried to keep to themselves, or hired guards if they could afford them. Soldiers returning from war, going into royal service, or simply deserting were frequent and very troublesome visitors. They were noisy, defiant, drank heavily, fought, molested women, and were not always ready to pay their bills on the strength of their weapons. Pilgrims traveling to holy places in England or beyond also needed shelter and food. They shared a common table and bed with vagrants, beggars, cripples, beggars, and outright criminals. Thieves, robbers, swindlers, and sometimes even murderers who were fugitives from justice. In such a motley and explosive company, there was always an atmosphere of mutual suspicion, latent enmity, and constant threat. Any careless word, a slanted glance, an accidental push, or an argument over a game of dice could instantly lead to a furious quarrel or even to a bloody stabbing with knives, daggers, or just heavy mugs. Robberies in and out of inns, especially under the cover of night, were common and even routine. A traveler could be drugged, searched while asleep, or simply attacked in a dark corner of the courtyard. Safety was a very relative concept. The innkeeper in this complex situation had to be not only the owner of the establishment, but also an experienced psychologist, a shrewd observer, and sometimes a bouncer or peacemaker. He knew many of his regular customers by sight, their habits, reputations, and possible intentions. Often, inns served as informal centers for gathering and disseminating news, rumors, and gossip. It was the place to find out the latest political news, information about troop movements, prices of goods in different markets, road conditions, or recent crimes. But it was also in taverns that intrigues and conspiracies could be hatched, and the innkeeper, willingly or unwillingly, could become an important source of information for the authorities, spies of opposing factions, or, on the contrary, for the local criminal world, warning their own of impending danger. If in times of relative peace the inn was a harsh place, full of danger and hardship, but still relatively predictable, then in times of war, feudal feuds, peasant uprisings, and other popular unrest that so often shook medieval England, it turned into a particularly dangerous and unreliable shelter. The warring parties, whether royal troops, baronial armies, or rebel bands, used taverns and their resources shamelessly and brutally for their own purposes, with little regard for the rights and interests of the owners or guests. Inns could be requisitioned and turned into temporary barracks for soldiers. They could be used as makeshift field hospitals to house and treat the wounded, who often lacked even basic medicine and care. Often the inns became grim places of interrogation, torture and execution of prisoners or suspected traitors. The innkeeper and his family found themselves in an extremely unenviable position, literally between a hammer and an anvil. The refusal to provide shelter, food, and fodder for the soldiers of either of the warring parties could cost them not only their entire property, but also their health and even their very lives. However, aiding and abetting one side automatically made them a legitimate target for the other as soon as the power in the area changed. Looting by soldiers of all armies was common and almost inevitable. Soldiers, who often did not receive their wages for months, looted not only the enemy, but also the civilian population. They took food, livestock, valuables, raped women, and left devastation and despair in their wake. Inns, where supplies were always available, were among the first to suffer. The owners had to hide their most valuable possessions and pray for salvation. The history of England, especially such turbulent periods as the anarchy of the reign of Stephen of Blois, the Peasants' Revolt of Wat Tyler, or the Bloody War of the Scarlet and White Rose, has preserved many examples when inns became mute witnesses and sometimes the direct arena of important historical events. It could be the site of secret meetings of conspirators planning the overthrow of the king or rebellion. Temporary alliances between previously feuding factions or plans for military operations could be made here. The loyalty or treachery of the innkeeper could play a decisive role. For example, during the Wars of the Roses, when England was split for decades into two irreconcilable warring camps, Lancaster and York supporters, inns often served as secret headquarters, meeting places or hiding places for supporters of one or the other dynasty. Their loyalty could determine the fate of entire towns and cities. To survive in such bloody chaos, the innkeeper had to be extremely cautious, cunning, keep his mouth shut, and a good deal of luck. The Middle Ages is not only the era of knights' tournaments, crusades, and the construction of majestic cathedrals, it is also a time of constant, exhausting human struggle with the ruthless forces of nature and invisible but deadly enemies. And the inn, as a kind of mirror, very accurately and unadorned, reflected all these everyday hardships of its harsh era. The long and cold winters were a particular hardship for the population, and for the inns in particular. Europe at that time was experiencing the so-called Little Ice Age, which began around the 14th century and was characterized by a significant cooling of the climate, harsher and longer winters, and frequent crop failures. Long, frosty winters meant a severe shortage of firewood, the main fuel for heating and cooking. The innkeeper had to work hard to provide his establishment with enough fuel. The inn buildings, poorly insulated and windswept, were freezing to the bone, and travelers suffered as much from cold as from hunger. Famine was another frequent and ruthless visitor to medieval England, as it was to the rest of Europe. Crop failures caused by droughts, heavy rains, early frosts, or locust invasions were a regular occurrence. They led to a dramatic reduction in the supply of grain and other foodstuffs and, as a consequence, to skyrocketing prices. In such hungry years, the menu of the inns became extremely meager and monotonous. Even a simple slice of stale bread or a bowl of stew made of bran and nettles could be an unaffordable luxury for many. Desperate, starving people left their homes and flocked to the towns and highways in search of some sustenance. Inns became their last, often phantom, hope, which alas was not always justified. But perhaps the most terrible and inescapable scourge of the Middle Ages were the numerous and devastating diseases. Epidemics of various infectious diseases, smallpox, typhus, dysentery, leprosy, influenza, broke out with frightening regularity, claiming thousands and hundreds of thousands of lives and devastating entire towns, villages, and regions. The Black Death, a pandemic of bubonic and pneumonic plague that swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, was a true catastrophe. According to various estimates, it wiped out between a third and a half of the continent's entire population, forever changing its social, economic, and demographic structure. Inns, with their inevitable crowding, poor sanitary conditions, and abundance of rats and fleas, vectors of plague, became ideal breeding grounds for any contagion. In times of terrible epidemics, they were either completely deserted, as people were terrified to leave their homes and avoided any contact, or turned into the last, gloomy shelters for already infected and dying travelers. Death was a commonplace, a constant companion of medieval man. The innkeeper was often the one who gave last aid, heard the last confession, or simply closed the eyes of his suddenly deceased guests. The bodies of the dead were often buried without much ceremony in mass graves nearby. And now let's take a closer look at the central figure of this harsh and dangerous world, the innkeeper himself. This was a far from unambiguous personality, complex and contradictory, forced to exist in extreme conditions. In romantic representations of later eras, he could be portrayed as a good-natured, well-fed merrymaker, always ready to welcome a guest and pour him a full mug of good ale. In the harsh reality, the medieval innkeeper was a true master of survival, a man who had to possess a whole set of very specific qualities and skills in order not only to run his business successfully, but also to simply stay alive and preserve his property. It was not a profession for the weak in mind or body. Running an inn business was extremely difficult, full of risks and pitfalls. The innkeeper was constantly being cheated by unscrupulous beer suppliers who diluted the beverage or delivered it sour, or by food vendors who slipped him rotten meat or wormy flour. He had to be very picky and careful. He had to deal with a diverse, often violent, drunk and aggressive clientele on a daily basis. He had to be able to find an approach to everyone, calm down an argument, prevent a fight, and sometimes even personally use physical force to kick a particularly zealous troublemaker out of the door at the risk of being stabbed. Often the inns and their owners became the object of extortion by corrupt local authorities, greedy collectors of numerous taxes and duties, or even gangs of forest robbers who demanded their share for protection or simply robbed under the cover of night. The innkeeper had to be a good psychologist to understand people at a glance, to guess their intentions, to foresee possible problems and conflicts. He had to be a skillful diplomat to get along skillfully with different, sometimes warring categories of customers without making unnecessary enemies. And of course, he needed nerves of iron, great physical stamina to work from morning till late at night, and a good deal of cunning, trickery, and even cynicism to survive and prosper in this cruel world. Too soft-hearted or gullible an innkeeper would quickly go bankrupt or fall victim to deceit and violence. Often he was assisted in everything by his wife, who took care of much of the kitchen, cleaning, laundry, if there was any, and serving the guests. Often it was the alewife who was in charge of the establishment, especially if her husband died or went to war. Historical chronicles and court records have preserved for us references both to honest, hospitable, and respectable innkeepers, and to extremely cruel, greedy, and unscrupulous individuals who did not shy away from any means of profit, including deception, cheating, diluting drinks, and sometimes complicity in robberies and even murders of their guests. The legal status of innkeepers and the taxes they were obliged to pay to the crown or the local feudal lord varied from period to period and from place to place. But one thing remained unchanged. It was hard, responsible, and very dangerous work, requiring constant exertion of all strength. So, we have opened the heavy veil of time and tried to look at a medieval English inn without romantic embellishments and later layers. It was by no means a place from the merry tales of Robin Hood or chivalrous novels about King Arthur. It was a harsh, dangerous, dirty, and extremely uncomfortable refuge, reflecting all the enormous hardships and unrelenting deprivations of that brutal era. The inn was a place where the paths of all kinds of people crossed, from a pious pilgrim to a hardened criminal, from a rich merchant to a beggarly vagabond. It was a place where every day was a struggle for survival, both for the road-weary traveler and for the innkeeper himself, balancing between risk and necessity.